In this video, we're going to carry on with our Ferrari 308 and Fusion 360, building out the front quarter panel. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on with our Ferrari 308. As always, you can go in the description and download the dataset as you see it on the screen. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue to build out the front quarter panel. So we want to connect the bottom edge that we have here and begin moving it forward, and we want to do the same and begin working our way backward. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by selecting this edge, and we can consider a couple different things. We can try to bridge these two edges together, or we can begin extruding and pulling this out and manually controlling the shape. Either option is fine. When I'm modeling something like this, again, I try to stay in box display mode, and I try to work manually. It's not always the fastest method, but I like to use things like extruding these edges to manually control where they're going to go. So I'm going to bring the canvas back. I'm going to hold down Alt because I want to have a smooth transition. And then I want to take this lower vertex and pull it back. What I'm doing is I'm slowly taking the angle of this edge and I'm transitioning it to be more vertical. I don't want to carry that sort of weird tweaked square shape or that polygon. I want to try to get more to four-sided consistent patches. So now that I have this one here, I have to decide whether or not this section is going to be a triangle or if this section is somehow going to be a four-sided patch and carry along the front. Because we know four-sided patches are ideal, I'm going to try to do that. So I'm going to just carry this one down. And again, I'm going to take this vertex and sort of bring it up, keeping in mind that we have crossed this midline, but we're going to move some stuff in a little bit. Now that I have that created, I'm going to go to Weld Vertices, and I'm going to put these two together, which automatically merges that edge for me. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. So now that I've sort of put those together, let's go into Smooth Display and just see what it looks like. I'm going to hide my canvases, and I want to take a look at the shape. When we look at it from the front, this corner is obviously sort of flared out, but the actual shape of the fender, the transition, looks pretty good. So the next thing that I want to do is go back to box display, and I want to carry this section over to the middle. Remember when we're working in the form tools in Fusion 360, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do everything in here. Now, honestly, doing everything in here is more complicated than it's worth. There are tools that in the surfacing environment that are a little bit easier. So I'm going to just sort of move some of these vertices around from the front. Again, just looking for a consistent patch. Keeping in mind that this edge being sort of tweaked out like that is not what I want. So I'm going to bring this over. And then before I really do too much, I'm going to bring this one down a little bit. And I'm going to use Alt. And I'm going to begin just extruding it out. I'm going to let go of Alt and do it one more time and bring that over. So obviously some changes have to be made, but let's go ahead and go to Weld Vertices and let's just put some of these together. So I'm going to go from here to here. It's going to merge those two, and then I can merge these two together across my mirror line. And I can go back to modify and edit form. As y'all are watching this, you also might wonder why I don't use hotkeys. Now, there are a lot of hotkeys that you can set up and that you can use in Fusion. Generally, I leave my menus exactly as they are default, and I try to avoid using hotkeys on topics where we're really doing a lot of explanation. And the reason for that is because I find it a lot harder to follow along when a lot of hotkeys are used. And when the hotkeys are used, a lot of beginner users or newer users lose sight of what they're actually trying to do. So they end up trying to scramble to figure out what was pressed or what happened. And instead of actually, figuring out what we're trying to learn, they spend more time just trying to figure out the interface. So sticking to a couple tools like Edit Form and Weld Vertices, and then really just focusing on where those are rather than spending a lot of time working on hotkeys. And also, in my professional life, I produce videos and tutorials for the software companies. So a lot of times I'm required to keep things exactly as it is installed. So default install, with the exception of things like I can change how the mouse wheel and how the rotate works. But because of that, my 3D mouse is in a closet, and I tend to keep everything as default as installed. So a lot of people do like to use quick keys, especially on other softwares, but at least for Fusion, I'm going to just stick with all the defaults. So as I was mentioning that, I was still kind of tweaking everything, and sort of the general plan is to make sure that everything is nice and consistent. And I don't really like how many edges are here up front. It makes it a little bit more difficult to control the curvature. We can potentially create some T-points here, but for right now, I think it looks okay. And when we go into a smooth display, what we're really looking at is whether or not we're capturing the shape of the Ferrari. So from the front, that looks pretty good. And we managed to keep four-sided patches. Now, there is a topic that does come up when you're doing this type of modeling, and that's figuring out the direction of these patches and and how that's going to control the shape that you're working on. So obviously, we started in the middle and we simply worked our way back. That was a defining characteristic of the car. And we have our fender, which is a wheel arch or an opening for the wheel, and that is a defining characteristic. And those two, blending them together, is often the biggest challenge that you'll have when you're trying to model a car, is because you have to go from the front of the car and wrap it around the side, and ideally you would carry the shape all the way back. Now, there is a modeling approach that we could use where we just make the underlying body shape and we make the fender well shape, and then using our surfacing tools combine them together. And honestly, that would give us probably a closer representation to the car. But the point of this is to learn the Fusion form tools. It's not to get necessarily the best result, but to learn how to use the tools. So, sort of designing myself into a corner by doing it this way, but I think it's important for people to learn. Now, as we're looking at the control up here, as I mentioned, that this is it's too many edges. We don't want to control that many. Because we really need the control for the fender just right here, I can likely get rid of these edges. I can select them and hit delete. And because of that T-point, the surface underneath is still pretty good. So it gives me enough control where I don't really have to worry about multiple edges competing for curvature. Now, as soon as I uncrease that edge, all bets are off, because then the surface up top is going to start pulling, and that surface likely is going to get a whole lot worse. But for right now, if we turn off the edges, the surface quality there with that T-point is really good, and the transition of the fender flare is pretty good. So I want to be mindful. I want to try to make shorter videos. So I'm not going to carry on modeling too much here, but I do want to focus a little bit more on the fender flare. And the way that this flares on the actual car is down here at the bottom, it pretty much disappears, but there's a very apparent flare up here. And the way for us to make that happen is to take a look at the vertex location and try to make this a straight line. And we can do this manually, or we can try to use a tool. So in Modify, we've got the Straighten tool. We can select these three vertices and make a straight line between them, and that'll help us blend that out. Now, it's important to note that we're straightening the control points. And if we take a look at the smooth display, those are going to be the surface points. So there is a difference there between control points and surface points. So make sure that you are using the correct one. Another thing to mention, I'm going to repeat that tool using my right-click marking menu, is you'll notice that we have these handles here. Now, these handles only are going to show up on open edges or edges with creases. So you can see here where we've got our crease, we've got these handles. These actually will allow us to manipulate the direction of curvature. So it's kind of a tricky topic, and it's something that's a bit more advanced. And I don't really want to get too much into it. But just note that if you see those handles pop up, if you're modifying an edge or a vertex, then if you modify these, so for example, if I pull this out, what I'm actually doing in the smooth display is I'm changing the direction of curvature. So if I use Control Z, and bring that back, you can see that's the direction the fender wants to go. But if I move it up in smooth display, we're not going to see it in box display, but if I move it up in smooth display, what I can do is I can get pretty close to tangent with that, even though I have a creased edge here. Now, one thing that happens you'll notice after you select that is this link tangent handle pops up. Now, if we click on that, it'll go back to tangent, which means that the curvature that is controlling the shape of this fender is going to start influencing where that handle is. So it's just something that you need to be aware of, and it really only shows up if you're on vertex selection. If you use the all selection, you won't see it there. And if you're on face or edge, you won't see it either. So it does pop up a couple times for things like straighten. So it can be very handy for straighten if you go into that tool and you want to say straighten this vertex, this one, and then the little point on the end. Sometimes it's hiding behind the surface. It can be hard to find. But sometimes you can use straighten to actually help control the curvature, even though we have a crease there. So again, that's the reason that I wanted to mention that and try to talk about how to blend the fender flare out. And before we go, let's make just a few more modifications. I really want to carry this edge to the back here. So I'm going to use Modify Edit Form again, hold down Alt, bring it back, and I'm going to pull this one back. If we want to, we can show the canvas again to try to stick to that body line. And really what I'm trying to do here when I pull these edges out is I want to make sure that, one, they're in the right direction. So I'm pulling it back. I'm always using either a single direction or a planar. And then when I use things like Modify Weld Vertices, I select the one I want to move first and the one I want to go to second to pull that in. So now if we go to our smooth display, we're beginning to carry that smooth body line back. And again, you can kind of see there's almost a little bit of a crease here, and that's just happening based on the amount of control we have. When we look at this in box display, this is a big face, and we're not really introducing a lot of control here. And if we don't need it, that's better. The surface quality will be so much better. So it's a good, it's a good time to sort of play around with that and figure out how to make these patches. I don't like the way that this edge is intersecting this fender here. So this is a case where I might come back and I might use straighten between these three vertices to pull that up. And I always want to make sure I look at it in smooth display. But that's a case where I might use that straighten to pull those three vertices into a straight line, which means that the quality of this surface, if I leave it a T-point here, is going to be much better. So now that we've gotten that done, let's go ahead and stand back, go to our smooth display, and just take a look at what we've done so far. So again, Control or Command 4 to get rid of those edges. And that looks pretty good. So you can see that the fender flare sort of fades away at the bottom, like we would expect, but it's pretty pronounced at the top. And that's what you would expect to see. Now on the actual car, that fender, that crease right there is more apparent. It doesn't blend in as smooth as we have it here, but ultimately, in order to do that, we would either need to add a crease and a fillet, or we would need to go and add additional edges. The good thing is that we've got some control here, but unfortunately, to make it work how it does on the car, we would need a triangular patch here. So for now, for the general body shape, I'm going to leave it as is, but that's a detail that we can always come back to later. But for right now, let's go ahead and make sure that we do save this and save often before we move on. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.